Hi, my name is Mark Lynn, and I'm the roommate coach. You're listening to KZZH 96.7 FM in Eureka, California. This will be episode 16 of The Roommate Coach. This is Shared Housing for the 21st Century, Part 2. The motto here is World Peace, one roommate at a time, although a little foreshadowing of the show itself. As I get more and more involved with the shared housing concept, I'm beginning to wonder if I need another motto, maybe a second one. But the world peace, one roommate at a time is a good one, so I'll stick with that for now. You can leave feedback, pro or con, about the show or anything at theroommatecoach.com. There's a contact and a feedback link on the homepage. The homepage, by the way, also has a link to a KZZH page where you can listen to all the prior shows. And I'm also putting links from the shows on that page as well. So if I mention a link, I will hopefully remember to put it on there so you won't have to guess at the spelling. And you could also leave feedback at area 707-362-8000. That's 707-362-8000. KZZH has been brought to the air here in Humboldt County by Access Humboldt. You could reach them at accesshumboldt.net. When I first got the idea to become the roommate coach and start the website and start discussing various ways that roommates could get along better to everyone's benefit, my primary motivation and the main group demographic that I was thinking of was college students. That's obviously a huge chunk of the population that, by definition, has roommates. And that's also where I began hearing about the prevalence of roommate problems. Mainly it was various postings on the forums and a lot of YouTube videos posted by people discussing their roommates from hell, as a common phrase. Every now and then, to be fair, I have to say I've seen a post or two where people actually rave about their roommates, so it's certainly not all bad, and that, to me, that's very encouraging, because that reminds me that it is quite possible to have very good roommate experiences. But just like we know good news doesn't sell like bad news does, so the roommates from hell postings on YouTube and places like that probably outnumber the good roommate postings, at least 20-1, maybe 100-1. I don't know. There's far more stories about the bad ones. That doesn't mean that the good ones aren't out there. It just means that people probably don't bother to post YouTubes about how much they like their roommate nearly as much as they do about problems they're having with their roommate. Anyway, I digress a bit, not for the first time, but that was my primary target, or so I thought. Now, as I've gone farther along with this whole adventure of being the roommate coach and hosting this show and doing the related activities, I'm beginning to realize there is a much bigger picture, even though college students were and will remain, hopefully, a big part of my audience. I think I have a lot to offer students trying to understand and make the most of the roommate experience. The bigger picture that I'm learning more and more about just about every day is probably the best umbrella term would be shared housing. It's something that has been around in one form or another, probably as long as there has been housing. I'd imagine going back to caveman days, I'm sure they shared their caves for various reasons. But it's becoming the whole concept of shared housing, people sharing housing expenses and everything else about it, is becoming a lot more of a trend in recent years, and that's the topic of today's show. Actually, this is the second show in the series about shared housing. The show from about a week and a half ago, episode 15, is where I started talking about it, discussing multi-generational issues, things like this. If you would like to listen to that show, or any of the other shows for that matter, you can do that on the website, theroommatecoach.com. On the home page, there is a link to KZZH that brings you to a page where you have access to all the former shows. Now, just to be clear, I probably sound like I'm getting all excited about the topic of shared housing as I learn more about how it's becoming a trend, and it's true, I am excited, but I don't mean to imply that I'm advocating for or against. I mean, there's plenty of times when people prefer to live alone, and that's just fine. I'm not saying that shared housing is better or worse, rather that it is an alternative, and as I'll discuss farther along in the show, it is probably going to become a necessity for more and more people in the coming years because of changes in our economies and our demographics and our world population and everything else. What I mean by this is I'm not advocating for or against shared housing. What I am saying is, since it looks like it's going to become a necessity, it's becoming inevitable for more and more of us in the coming years, so why not make the most of it? And this is where the roommate coach comes in, is since if you're not sharing housing, you don't have roommates, but if you are sharing housing, which more and more of us are going to be doing, then by definition you will have roommates. And if you've got roommates, why not get along with them as well as you can? Now, one interesting thing about roommates is the notion that the roommate time in one's life is kind of a transition, that it's just a time in between leaving home and settling down with a family of your own. That thinking seems to be changing relatively rapidly. So with that in mind, what I'm going to do with this show, and possibly the next one as well, depending on how much time it takes, is I'd like to discuss the different stages of life that can be affected by the shared housing trend. I'll start out with the young people and some of the reasons why it's relevant and why it is in many cases becoming more and more of a necessity. Then I'll move into people in the middle of their lives, which in the past would probably be the last group that you would think that might require or be a potential shared housing user, but this seems to be changing as well. And then I guess the third segment, where it's pretty obvious that many of us do want to look into alternatives and various options for sharing housing, is the seniors. So I'll very roughly break it down into about 3 segments going on from here. You're listening to The Roommate Coach. My name is Mark Lynn. This is KZZH 96.7 FM in Eureka, California. This is episode 16 of The Roommate Coach. This is Shared Housing for the 21st Century, Part 2. The motto here at The Roommate Coach is World Peace, one roommate at a time. And as I'll be discussing in this show and possibly the next one as well, since shared housing is becoming more and more of a trend pretty much everywhere, it's quite possible that people at almost any stage in their life could benefit from a little extra world peace, one roommate at a time. If you'd like to leave feedback for the Roommate Coach, you can do so at theroommatecoach.com. You can use the contact link on the homepage. You could also leave a voicemail 24/7 at 707-362-8000. That's 707-362-8000. So for young people, I'll start out discussing some of the reasons why they are more likely than ever to be candidates for shared housing. I'm going to quote a little bit from an article here in the New York Times from a couple years ago. This particular article is titled, "It's Official, the Boomerang Kids Won't Leave." And I will have the links to this article and others that I may discuss in the show notes on the web page. This article quotes a few statistics that are kind of discouraging, but they're part of the reality we're stuck with, so I'll just list a few here. What they're saying is 1 in 5 people in their 20s and early 30s is currently living with his or her parents, and 60% of all young adults receive financial support from them. That's a quote. Now they go on to say that this is an increase from a generation ago. A generation ago, only 1 in 10 young adults moved back home, and few received financial support. And that's almost a quote right there. Now, some more discouraging information that most of us are pretty familiar with, but just to get it spelled out, they say nearly 45% of 25-year-olds have outstanding loans with average debt above $20,000. And more than half of recent college graduates are unemployed or underemployed. Now, I know we're generally led to believe that good times are just right around the corner, but unfortunately, this particular article throws a bit of cold water on that notion, at least as far as young people are concerned. Another quote here, they're saying, quote, "Since 1980, the U.S. economy has been destabilized by a series of systemic changes. The growth of foreign trade, rapid advances in technology, changes to the tax code, among others, that have affected all workers, but particularly those just embarking on their careers." End quote. So the fact that this doesn't seem like some kind of a short-term thing, that if this trend has been in effect, this negative trend, for young people just getting started, facing higher and higher costs for everything, frequently starting out with a fair amount of debt, and a relatively lousy job market, if that has in fact been the case to some extent for over 30 years, that doesn't sound very encouraging. So where that leaves me is to suspect that young people are probably going to be very much in line for saving expenses however they can, and back to the title of the episode, shared housing is a great way to go. As it turns out, the market is responding, and some enterprising souls are coming up with what they're listing as some things to help at least some of these young people. I'll get to those in just a minute here. So here's another quote from an article from money.cnn.com from 2014. I'll put this link in the notes also on the website. This one is titled, "The Latest Trend in Housing, Roommates." The subhead is, quote, "With rents rising faster than most Americans' paychecks, finding a roommate to split the bills with isn't just for kids straight out of college anymore." End quote. They go on to say that the percentage of adults living with someone other than a spouse or partner hit 32% nationwide in 2012, up from 26% in 2000. What all this boils down to, as far as I can tell, is it's certainly going to be difficult, probably more difficult than ever, for quite a few young people to really get a toehold, get started, which is why doing anything they can to save on housing expenses is going to be very much to the good and probably essential. Now, there is a trend in terms of some ideas that the marketplace has come up with to address some of these people. I would like to report that just about any young person is going to be able to benefit from this trend, but unfortunately, I don't think that's the case. I'm talking about what is being referred to as co-living. And from what I can tell so far, anyway, and it seems like a relatively new development, this particular trend seems to be aimed mainly at those people who are able to get fairly good-paying jobs in the big cities. And that's the catch, is to get a fairly good-paying job, you have to go to where the rents are even more outrageous than ever, which is the big cities where the good-paying jobs are. More specifically, thinking about the tech arena, San Francisco comes to mind as probably one of the best examples, but that's not the only case. So it's really a bind for a young person. If they're lucky enough to land a really good job, they have to go someplace where the rents are enough to absorb darn near every bit of it in some cases. So what they do is they double up roommates. That's a pretty established procedure, way to go. But that's a problem too, beyond the problems I talk about as the roommate coach. If you're new to an area and you don't know where you want to be and you don't know how long you're going to be there, it's pretty impractical to go ahead and sign up for a long-term lease. So this is where co-living comes in. You're listening to The Roommate Coach on KZZH 96.7 FM in Eureka, California. My name's Mark Lynn. This is episode 16 of The Roommate Coach. We're talking about shared housing alternatives and options for the 21st century. Just about to get into co-living. But first, just a couple quick words about things like feedback. If you'd like to leave feedback for me, you can do that on the web at theroommatecoach.com using the contact link on the homepage. You could also leave a voicemail 24/7 at 707-362-8000. That's 707-362-8000. The bumper music here on The Roommate Coach is called Rollin' at 5. That's by Kevin MacLeod. And I always like to mention that KZZH has been graciously brought to the air here in Humboldt County by Access Humboldt. They can be reached at accesshumboldt.net. We're talking about housing, shared housing alternatives for the 21st century, and just about to start discussing co-living. As it happens, the other term that's come into use for shared housing also starts with co, oddly enough, and that would be co-housing. Now, the distinction between the two seems to follow, as far as I can tell, follows the big distinction among housing, the big decision that many of us face at some time or another is rent or buy. So the co-living is largely aimed at young people just getting started and more mobile, more inclined to be moving around. So this is an alternative for the renting. The co-living generally does not imply equity or ownership. And co-housing, on the other hand, refers to alternatives, shared housing options for people that do want to buy various alternatives. I'll get into that probably in the next show. That'll be part 3. So as far as co-living, just what exactly is up with that, and what's that all about? The term co-living apparently comes from either communal living or cooperative living, and if you want to use it as a search term on Google or online, you don't need the hyphen, just spell it the way you'd expect, co-living, all one word. It's one of those things that is old and new all at the same time. It's old in that it's just group living. It's several people or some number of people sharing a space and sharing the expenses. And of course, that's been around pretty much forever. I mean, rooming houses, boarding houses, and any number of variations on that. Now, the new part comes from a relatively recent attempt in recent years on the part of a growing number of entrepreneurs are coming up with quite a few interesting variations on the theme, largely aimed, not exclusively, but largely aimed at young people who are, in many cases, trying to get started in the big cities, and for a variety of reasons. And I've been emphasizing the financial, and that is a big part of it. Financial it's a big reason for some of these housing alternatives. But what I'm coming to realize is it's certainly not the only reason. It's not the only reason in the case of co-living, at least for some of the alternatives that are starting to show up. The advantage or the benefit that appears to be every bit as important, and apparently in some cases even more so than the financial, is the idea of community. And that's probably another part of the co in co-living. But all of the alternatives that I've explored and investigated so far, and there are more cropping up all the time, really emphasize, if you think about moving to a big city, if you're a young person and you've just gotten a job offer in a big city and maybe you're in a small town somewhere, you move to a big city, and even if you find a roommate online on Craigslist or something, you're still relatively isolated. And even worse, if you get a place by yourself, then you're all alone in the big city. And that's a pretty well-known phenomenon. So these alternatives, these co-living options, are taking aim at providing a sense of community, in addition to making it a lot easier to move in and out. That's another advantage they offer, is if you're getting started in a new job in a new city, you may not want to sign a long-term lease because you don't know if it's going to work out. You don't know how long you'll want to stay. An interesting aspect of the co-living trend is that there appears to be a continuum, in that they're certainly not all the same. On one extreme, and an example of the extreme I'm referring to here, which is the minimal privacy and maximum shared space. An example of that would be a new outfit. I think they're based in Los Angeles, called Podshare. Podshare.org, I believe, is their website. I'll put the link online, as I'm doing with the others. And the continuum, again, this is all shared space and this is all rental. These are not for people buying. There's no equity involved here. It's an alternative to renting an apartment or renting a room. The other end of the continuum I'm referring to would be more privacy, but still quite a bit of shared space. An example of the on the other end of on this end of the continuum, emphasizing more privacy as well as shared space, would be an outfit called Common Space. And they are based, of all places, in Syracuse, New York. And I'm not sure how much time I'll have left in this show, but I may get to some quotes from them, from their website here in a minute. I also intend to do my best to interview some of the people involved in these different places in future shows as soon as possible. Another example, referring to what I was talking about earlier, the people moving into the big expensive cities, San Francisco being a fine example of a really expensive city where maybe you can come up with a really good job if you're in the tech field, but it's going to cost you an arm and a leg to live there. Well, there's a company called Common, Common.com, interesting website, and they are offering co-living options for young, relatively, I guess you'd have to say, reasonably well-to-do people in San Francisco, because their offerings are not inexpensive. They're probably, I could be mistaken about what I'm about to say here, but it looks like that if you were in San Francisco and you got a fairly expensive rental and managed to find one or two roommates, it looks like you'd wind up spending about what it costs to live in Common. And it may even cost more. So this particular example does not seem to emphasize the financial benefit, but it's more the convenience and the community. That seems to be the big deal for all of these, is emphasizing the fact that you've got an instant community and you've got people that you're sharing the whole experience with. Now that may be good and may not always be so good. That's, again, going back to my goal as the roommate coach, is to do whatever I can to help us figure out ways to get along as well as possible, which is extra important when we're sharing space. Well, once again, I'm just about out of time. I like to keep these to about half an hour, and I'm pretty much right up to that point right now. So I will have to go into probably at least a part 3, maybe part 4, but I'll go into more detail on some of these co-living alternatives I've mentioned in my next show. But for now, I'll go ahead and wrap up here by reminding everyone that you're listening to The Roommate Coach on KZZH 96.7 FM in Eureka, California. My name is Mark Lynn. I'm the Roommate Coach, and the motto here is World Peace, one roommate at a time. This has been part 2 of what is apparently turning into a series of housing alternatives, shared housing alternatives for the 21st century. It's pretty obvious when you think about it that roommates implies shared housing, so I'm kind of backing up a little bit and getting to the underlying reasons why we need roommates in the first place, and the fact that housing is changing a lot in recent years as our world is changing in so many ways. Because of that, there's any number of shared housing alternatives that are starting to crop up, so I'm exploring them, and I hope to even be able to interview some people that are directly involved in the field. I'll do that in coming shows. But as I said, you can leave me feedback about all this, or anything for that matter, at theroommatecoach.com. There's a contact link on the homepage, and while you're on the homepage, if you notice the KZZH link, there's a nice picture of a microphone and everything. You'll see KZZH on the homepage. That one will bring you to a page where you can listen to all the prior shows if you want to. They're all YouTube audios. You could also go to the YouTube channel for the Roommate Coach. You can also leave feedback on voicemail 24/7 at area 707-362-8000, at 707-362-8000. KZZH has been brought to the air by Access Humboldt here in Eureka. You can reach them at accesshumboldt.net. And I believe I mentioned before, but it's worth repeating because I really like the bumper music. It's called Rollin' at 5, and that's by Kevin MacLeod. So that will be it for this episode 16 of The Roommate Coach. And again, my name is Mark Lynn. I'm the Roommate Coach. I'm enjoying talking to you. I hope you're enjoying the show. And I thank you a lot for listening. And I look forward to talking to you again real soon. So long for now.